Every morning before going to work, George goes to the café to read the newspaper and drink coffee. George is 38 years old and lost his father in a car accident at a young age. After his father's absence, he began to live a quiet life. George was drinking his coffee when he saw someone sitting at the next table. That's when he realized something. Yesterday, when he came to the cafe again, he noticed the same person sitting at the same table. The man occasionally looked at George, but George thought it was a coincidence, so he drank his coffee and went to work. In the evening, when George came home on the subway, he saw the same man as in the morning. Again, George thought it was a coincidence. In the morning, George went to his favorite cafe for coffee again. In the cafe, the same man was sitting at the same table and occasionally looked at George again. George now thought that this was not a coincidence. He had many questions in his mind. Why is this man watching me? Is he going to do something to me? George started to get scared, but he sat in the cafe and drank his coffee so as not to let the man know. After drinking his coffee, he immediately left the cafe and went to work. He thought about that man until he came home from work. George decided not to go to that cafe for a while. Morning came, and George went to another cafe for coffee. On the subway ride home after work, he saw that man again. George could not hide his surprise. When he returned home in the evening, he thought long and hard about this incident. Finally, he made a decision to go to that man in the morning and ask him why he was following me. George woke up in the morning, but he was a little stressed because he didn't know how the man would react. But he wanted to know who the man was and why he was following him. George left the house and walked to the cafe. He arrived at the cafe and saw the man sitting at the same table. He went over to the man and sat down at his table. George politely asked the man, "Excuse me, I think we've met a lot lately. Is this a coincidence?" The man slowly looked up and said to George, "You are right to think so, but it is not a coincidence." George was surprised by these words and said, "What do you mean it's not a coincidence?" The man said, "I have something to tell you," and began to explain. "My name is John. Years ago I made a big mistake and caused an accident." George said, "What has that got to do with me?" John looked down and said, "The man who died in the accident was your father." George was in great shock. He almost didn't know what to feel. George had lost his father in a car accident at a young age. He didn't know who the driver was. All he knew was that the driver was in prison after that incident. George's eyes welled up and he was silent for a while. John said, "I'm sorry. I didn't even realize what I had done that day. It was a long time ago, but the incident still haunts me. The first thing I did when I got out of prison was to find you. I can't repay your father, but at least I wanted to find you and apologize to you." George took a deep breath and thought for a while. He could have gotten angry and yelled at the man. He could have fought. George realized that none of this would do any good and told the man in a calm voice that it was important to know the truth. "I grew up without a father at a young age and had a hard time. I don't know if my father would forgive you, but I forgive you." John said, "Thank you very much for your forgiveness," and they chatted for a while. Then George said goodbye and went to work. George never saw John again after that day, but it was as if a great burden had been lifted. Sometimes the shadows of the past come back to teach us lessons. Forgiveness is the greatest freedom of all.